Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful story from long ago. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought, all of us scattered across time zones sharing this moment. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, consider subscribing. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come. I'm going to take you inside the gilded prison of Versailles and show you how a 14-year-old girl from Austria became the symbol of everything wrong with the French monarchy. You'll discover the shocking truth about the diamond necklace affair that destroyed her reputation, the real reasons the French people turned against her, and how a mother of four became the most famous victim of the guillotine. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why Marie Antoinette's story isn't just about one woman's downfall, but about the violent birth of the modern world. What makes this even story more incredible is that I've uncovered details from her personal letters, court records, and eyewitness accounts that reveal a completely different side of the woman they called the Austrian whore. These aren't just dry historical facts. These are intimate glimpses into the mind of someone who watched her world crumble around her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the scaffold. Let me start with a scene that will change everything you think you know about Marie Antoinette. It's October 1770, and a terrified 14-year-old girl stands naked in a wooden hut built specifically for this moment on a small island in the Rhine River. This island sits exactly on the border between Austria and France. And what's happening here is more than just a marriage ceremony. It's a political transaction that will determine the fate of two empires. The girl is Maria Antonia, Archduchess of Austria, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, the most powerful woman in Europe. But in a few minutes, she won't be Maria Antonia anymore. She'll be Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. And according to the bizarre protocol of royal marriages, she cannot bring a single thread of Austrian fabric with her into France. Not her clothes, not her jewellery, not even her undergarments. French ladies-in-waiting strip away every piece of her Austrian identity and dress her in French silk. They take her Austrian hairpins and replace them with French ones. Even her beloved dog, a tiny spaniel named Mops, must stay behind. This ritual humiliation is designed to show that she belongs to France now, completely and utterly. But what the French don't understand is that they're creating their own enemy. By demanding she abandon everything Austrian, they're ensuring she'll never truly feel French. The young Archduchess speaks almost no French. She's been raised in the informal atmosphere of the Austrian court, where her mother, despite being an empress, often acted more like a loving but strict parent than a distant monarch. Maria Antonia has spent her childhood playing with her brothers and sisters, learning to dance and sing, and receiving just enough education to make polite conversation. Nobody bothered to teach her about politics, economics, or the complex web of alliances that her marriage is supposed to cement. As she crosses into France, Marie Antoinette has no idea that she's walking into the most rigid, most artificial court in Europe. Versailles operates according to rules so complex and absurd that even French nobles struggle to understand them. Every moment of the royal family's day is governed by ancient protocols that dictate who can speak to who can sit in whose presence, and who has the honour of handing the Queen her chemise in the morning. The carriage carrying the new Dauphine toward Versailles passes through French villages where people live in conditions that would shock a modern observer. Peasants dwell in one-room hovels with dirt floors and no windows. Families of 8 or 10 people sleep huddled together for warmth, sharing their space with chickens and pigs. Children wear rags and go barefoot even in winter. The average French peasant consumes fewer calories per day than prisoners in modern American jails. But Marie Antoinette sees none of this from inside her golden carriage. The route has been carefully planned to showcase only the most prosperous towns and the most beautiful landscapes. French officials have even paid some villagers to line the roads wearing their best clothes and cheering enthusiastically. It's elaborate theatre designed to convince the Austrian princess that France is thriving under royal rule. When she finally arrives at Versailles, Marie Antoinette enters a world that defies comprehension. The palace contains over 2,000 rooms spread across more than 60,000 square meters. The Hall of Mirrors alone is longer than a football field and contains 357 mirrors, each one worth more than a peasant family earns in a decade. Crystal chandeliers hang from painted ceilings that took armies of artists years to complete. But the true extravagance isn't in the architecture. It's in the daily routine of court life. Every morning, the ritual of dressing the Queen involves dozens of nobles, each with a specific role determined by their rank. The highest-ranking duchess present has the honour of handing Marie Antoinette her chemise. If a princess of royal blood arrives during the ceremony, the chemise must be passed back through the ranks until it reaches her hands, even if the Queen is standing naked and shivering. This isn't just protocol. It's a deliberate system designed to keep the nobility occupied with meaningless ceremonies, so they won't have time to plot against the crown. Louis XIV, the Sun King who built Versailles, understood that idle nobles are dangerous nobles. By forcing them to compete for the privilege of watching him eat breakfast or helping him put on his shoes, he transformed potential rebels into dependent courtiers. Marie Antoinette finds herself at the center of this bizarre world, married to a prince who seems more interested in locksmithing than romance. Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, is an awkward, overweight young man who spends hours in his workshop making keys and fixing clocks. He stutters when he speaks and blushes when women look at him. Their wedding night is a disaster, and their marriage remains unconsummated for 7 years. The French court watches this marital failure with fascination and cruelty. Courtiers whisper that the Austrian princess is frigid, or that the Dauphin is impotent, or that both are so ignorant they don't know how to consummate their marriage. These whispers eventually become published pamphlets that circulate throughout Paris, turning the royal couple's private struggles into public entertainment. Desperate to escape the suffocating protocol of Versailles, Marie Antoinette begins seeking pleasure wherever she can find it. She discovers gambling, staying up until dawn, playing cards for stakes that could feed hundreds of families. She develops a passion for elaborate hairstyles that require 3 hours to construct and consume enough powder to bake bread for a village. She commissions gowns so extravagant that each one costs more than a skilled craftsman earns in a lifetime. But it's her friendship with the Duchesse de Polignac that truly scandalizes the court. Gabrielle de Polignac is everything Marie Antoinette is not: sophisticated, witty, and born to French court life. She becomes the Queen's closest confidant, and rumours immediately begin circulating about the nature of their relationship. In an age when royal marriages are political arrangements and genuine affection is rare, the intensity of female friendships often raises eyebrows. Marie Antoinette showers the Polignac family with gifts, titles, and pensions worth hundreds of thousands of livres per year. She builds them a private theatre at Versailles and performs in amateur productions alongside them. To the struggling French people, these expenditures seem obscenely wasteful. To Marie Antoinette, they're the only source of genuine happiness in her gilded prison. The Queen's behaviour becomes more reckless as her isolation deepens. She starts hosting private parties at the Petit Trianon, a small palace Louis XV built for his mistress. Here, away from the formal protocol of Versailles, Marie Antoinette can pretend to live a simpler life. She dresses as a shepherdess and plays at milking cows. She tends a garden and serves tea to her friends from porcelain cups that cost more than most people's houses. This pastoral fantasy enrages the French public more than her gambling or her gowns. While real peasants struggle to survive, their queen is playing at being a peasant for entertainment. Political cartoonists have a field day depicting Marie Antoinette as a frivolous child playing dress-up while France crumbles around her. The situation becomes even more complicated when she finally gives birth to her first child in 1778. The birth of Marie-Thérèse is attended by dozens of courtiers. as royal protocol demands that noble witnesses observe the delivery to confirm the child's legitimacy. Marie Antoinette nearly suffocates from the crowd and the heat before doctors finally clear the room. Motherhood changes her in unexpected ways. She becomes fiercely protective of her children and increasingly resentful of the court protocols that limit her time with them. She starts spending more hours at the Petit Trianon, creating a private world where she can be a mother first and a queen second. But this retreat from public life only fuels more speculation about her character and her loyalty to France. The birth of her son, Louis Joseph, in 1781, should have secured her position and silenced her critics. Finally, she has provided France with a male heir. But instead of gratitude, she faces new accusations. Pamphlets begin circulating, suggesting that the Dauphin is not really the king's son, that Marie Antoinette has been having affairs with various courtiers and foreign ambassadors. These libelles, as they're called, become increasingly graphic and vicious. They depict the queen as a nymphomaniac, a lesbian, a spy for Austria, and a creature so depraved that she corrupts everyone around her. The attacks aren't random. They're part of a coordinated campaign by political enemies who understand that destroying Marie Antoinette's reputation is the first step toward undermining the monarchy itself. What makes these attacks so effective is that they contain just enough truth to seem credible. Marie Antoinette does spend enormous sums on clothing and entertainment. She is close to her mother and does sometimes share French political information with Austria. She does have intense friendships with both men and women that appear to go beyond normal court relationships. But the pamphlets transform these human traits into monstrous perversions, creating a fictional version of Marie Antoinette that becomes more real to the French people than the actual woman. The propaganda machine against Marie Antoinette reaches its peak with an event that seems almost too bizarre to be real, yet it destroys her reputation more thoroughly than any previous scandal. It's 1784, and a con artist named Jeanne de la Motte is about to orchestrate one of history's most audacious frauds, using nothing but the Queen's name and the greed of a cardinal who should have known better. Cardinal Louis de Rohan stands in his private chambers, holding what he believes is a love letter from Marie Antoinette. His hands shake slightly as he reads the elegant handwriting that promises him her favour if he can help her acquire a magnificent diamond necklace. The cardinal has spent years trying to win back the Queen's approval after offending her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, decades earlier. This letter seems like his chance for redemption. What Rohan doesn't know is that he's never actually met Marie Antoinette face to face. Every interaction he believes he's had with her has been orchestrated by Jeanne de la Motte, a minor aristocrat drowning in debt who has discovered that the cardinal's desperation makes him the perfect mark for an elaborate con game. The necklace at the centre of this scheme is a masterpiece of Jew artillaires containing 540 diamonds weighing nearly 3,000 carats. Louis XV originally commissioned it for his mistress, Madame du Barry, but he died before completing the purchase. The jewellers Boehmer and Bassange have been trying to sell it ever since, and they're facing bankruptcy if they can't find a buyer soon. Jeanne de la Motte convinces Cardinal Rohan that Marie Antoinette wants the necklace, but can't purchase it publicly because of France's financial troubles. The Queen supposedly needs him to act as her secret intermediary. To prove the Queen's involvement, de la Motte arranges a midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles between Rohan and a woman he believes is Marie Antoinette. The woman who meets Rohan in the darkness is actually Nicole Legoet, a prostitute who bears a slight resemblance to the Queen. Dressed in a simple white gown with a wide-brimmed hat that shadows her face, she hands the cardinal a rose and whispers a few words before quickly disappearing into the night. Rohan is convinced he's just had a secret romantic encounter with the Queen of France. Based on this fabricated meeting, Cardinal Rohan agrees to guarantee payment for the necklace. The jewellers hand over their masterpiece to someone they believe is the cardinal's servant, but who is actually Jeanne de la Motte's husband. The couple immediately begins breaking up the necklace and selling the individual diamonds across Europe. When the jewelers approach Marie Antoinette for payment, she's genuinely confused. She's never seen the necklace, never wanted to buy it, and certainly never asked Cardinal Rohan to help her acquire it. Her confusion quickly turns to rage when she realizes that someone has been impersonating her and using her name to commit fraud. The scandal explodes across France when Cardinal Rohan is arrested during a public ceremony at Versailles. The sight of a cardinal of the Catholic Church being led away in chains while wearing his full ceremonial robes creates a sensation that reverberates throughout European society. But instead of sympathy for Marie Antoinette as the victim of this fraud, the French public assumes she must be involved. The trial becomes a public spectacle that transforms Jeanne de la Motte into an unlikely heroine and Marie Antoinette into the villain. De la Motte claims that she was acting on the Queen's direct orders, that Marie Antoinette promised to reward her for helping acquire the necklace secretly. She portrays a servant betrayed by Aze herself as a loyal queen who wanted to enjoy her diamonds while letting others take the blame for the theft. Cardinal Rohan's defense is even more damaging to Marie Antoinette's reputation. His lawyers argue that their client was an innocent dupe, a man of God who was manipulated by a corrupt queen and her accomplices. They present the forged letters, supposedly written by Marie Antoinette. And even though handwriting experts prove they're fake, the damage to her reputation is irreversible. The French public chooses to believe the most scandalous version of events. They want to believe that their Austrian queen is capable of stealing diamonds, deceiving cardinals, and betraying anyone who trusts her. The trial gives them permission to voice all their accumulated resentment against a woman they've never trusted, and now feel justified in hating. Marie Antoinette watches her reputation crumble from the witness stand as she testifies about events she had no part in. She speaks clearly and directly, explaining that she never met with Cardinal Rohan, never wrote him letters, and never wanted the diamond necklace. Her testimony is truthful and convincing, but truth has become irrelevant. The verdict should vindicate her. Cardinal Rohan is acquitted, which officially confirms that he was deceived and that Marie Antoinette was not involved in the fraud. Jeanne de la Motte is found guilty and sentenced to be whipped, branded, and imprisoned. But the French people interpret even this outcome as proof of corruption, assuming that the Queen used her influence to escape justice while letting others suffer for her crimes. The diamond necklace affair marks a turning point in how the French view their Queen. Before this scandal, criticism focused mainly on her spending and her Austrian origins. Now she's seen as actively criminal, a woman who will lie, cheat, and steal to satisfy her desires. The affair creates a narrative framework that makes every subsequent accusation against her seem credible. Marie Antoinette retreats further into her private world, spending more time at the Petit Trianon and less time performing her public duties. She commissions architects to create an elaborate English-style garden, complete with artificial ruins, a grotto, and a working farm where she can pretend to live as a simple country woman. The cost of these improvements is staggering, but she seems unable to understand how her behavior appears to her subjects. Her relationship with her husband becomes more strained as the political situation deteriorates. Louis XVI, never comfortable with confrontation, responds to growing criticism by becoming even more withdrawn and indecisive. He spends hours in his locksmithing workshop while his kingdom slides toward bankruptcy and revolution. The royal couple's inability to present a united front makes them appear weak and out of touch. The Queen's Austrian heritage becomes an even greater liability as tensions rise between France and Austria over various European conflicts. Every letter she writes to her mother is assumed to contain state secrets. Every Austrian diplomat who visits Versailles is suspected of being her spy. The fact that she sometimes does share political information with her family makes these suspicions seem justified, even though her spying consists mainly of gossip about court personalities rather than military secrets. Meanwhile, France's financial crisis deepens with each passing year. The government spends more than half its budget servicing debts accumulated from previous wars including the expensive French support for the American Revolution. Tax collection is inefficient and corrupt, with nobles and clergy exempt from most levies. The burden falls heaviest on the very people least able to bear it: peasants and urban workers whose living standards have been declining for decades. Marie Antoinette seems oblivious to these broader problems, focusing instead on her family and her increasingly elaborate private entertainments. When her second son, Louis Charles, is born in 1785, she throws elaborate celebrations while bread riots break out in Paris. When drought destroys harvests across France, she commissions new gowns and hairstyles that require imported silks and exotic feathers. Her behavior during this period isn't malicious, but it reveals a stunning disconnection from reality. She's been raised to believe that royal luxury is natural and necessary, that her happiness is important to France's well-being, and that economic problems are temporary difficulties that others will solve. The idea that her personal spending might be related to her subjects' suffering simply doesn't occur to her. The birth of her daughter Sophie in 1786 should be a joyful event, but the child lives only 11 months. Marie Antoinette's grief over this loss is genuine and profound, but even her mourning becomes controversial. Critics claim she's performing sorrow to win sympathy, or that she's more upset about losing a child than about the suffering of French families who can't feed their children. By 1787, France faces complete financial collapse. The government cannot borrow more money, cannot raise taxes without triggering revolts, and cannot cut spending without eliminating essential services. Finance Minister Charles-Alexandre de Calonne proposes taxing the nobility and clergy for the first time, but the privileged classes refuse to cooperate. The political system that has governed France for centuries is breaking down. Marie Antoinette plays almost no role in these discussions about France's future. She attends council meetings occasionally, but rarely speaks about policy. Her influence is exercised privately, through conversations with her husband and letters to family members. Yet pamphlets and newspapers portray her as the real power behind the throne, a manipulative foreign queen who controls every government decision. The Assembly of Notables that convenes in 1787 to address the financial crisis becomes another opportunity to attack the queen. Noble delegates complain about court expenses, royal pensions, and the cost of maintaining Versailles. They don't mention that their own tax exemptions are the primary cause of France's fiscal problems, preferring to blame everything on royal extravagance. Marie Antoinette becomes the symbol of everything wrong with the old system, even though she wields little real political power. Her Austrian birth makes her foreign, her spending makes her selfish, her beauty makes her vain, her friendships make her corrupt. The propaganda campaign against her has been so successful that she's transformed from a person into a symbol of royal tyranny. Queen seems to sense that her world is ending, though she may not understand how completely it will be destroyed. She spends more time with her children, teaching them to read and play music. She writes longer letters to her mother and brothers, sharing details about her daily life that suggest she's trying to preserve memories of happier times. In her private letters from this period, Marie Antoinette reveals a woman beginning to grasp the magnitude of her situation. She writes to her brother Leopold, "I feel as though I am surrounded by an abyss that grows deeper each day." But even as she senses danger, she cannot bring herself to change her behavior in ways that might save her. The Queen's final pregnancy arrives at the worst possible moment. In 1786, as France teeters on the edge of bankruptcy, she gives birth to her fourth child, Princess Sophie. The baby is weak from birth, struggling to breathe and unable to nurse properly. Marie Antoinette spends sleepless nights holding her daughter, watching for signs of improvement that never come. When Sophie dies at 11 months old, something breaks inside Marie Antoinette. Courtiers notice that she ages rapidly, her famous golden hair turning grey almost overnight. She begins wearing simpler clothes and spending less on frivolous entertainments. But this transformation comes too late to change public opinion. The French people interpret her grief as another performance, another attempt to manipulate their emotions. The irony is crushing. Just as Marie Antoinette begins to mature into someone who might have been a capable queen, the political system she represents is collapsing beyond repair. Her newfound seriousness makes no difference because she's no longer seen as a real person. She's become a character in a story that the French people are telling themselves about their own suffering. Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker who becomes France's finance minister, understands better than anyone how desperate the situation has become. He publishes his famous Compte Rendu, a public accounting of royal finances that reveals the staggering cost of maintaining the monarchy. The document shows that Versailles consumes nearly 6 million livres annually just for basic operations, not including construction projects, court entertainments, or royal pensions. The Compte Rendu becomes a bestseller, one of the most widely read documents in French history. Citizens who have never seen accurate government financial information suddenly understand exactly how their tax money is being spent. They learn that the Queen's annual clothing budget exceeds the total income of entire provinces. They discover that her gambling losses in a single evening could support dozens of families for years. Marie Antoinette reads Necker's report in her private apartments, surrounded by the very luxuries it catalogues. For perhaps the first time, she sees her lifestyle through the eyes of her subjects. The silk wallpaper, the gold-framed mirrors, the armies of servants who attend to her every need, all of it takes on a different meaning when she understands its true cost. But understanding and changing are different things entirely. The machinery of Versailles operates according to its own logic, and Marie Antoinette finds herself trapped within systems she cannot alter. When she tries to reduce her clothing expenses, merchants and craftsmen complain that she's destroying their livelihoods. When she attempts to simplify court ceremonies, nobles protest that she's undermining centuries of tradition. The Queen's most tragic mistake during this period is her treatment of the Estates General, the ancient French Parliament that Louis XVI finally convenes in May 1789, after more than a century and a half of royal absolutism. This gathering of representatives from the nobility, clergy, and common people represents France's last chance to reform peacefully. Instead, it becomes the spark that ignites revolution. Marie Antoinette views the Estates General as a temporary inconvenience, a ceremonial gathering that will approve new taxes and then dissolve. She pays little attention to the election campaigns or the cahiers de doléances, the lists of grievances that citizens submit to their representatives. If she had read these documents, she would have discovered that her name appears in complaints from every corner of France. The Third Estate, representing everyone who isn't noble or clergy, arrives in Paris with unprecedented determination to transform French society. These lawyers, merchants, and property owners have spent months organizing, debating, and preparing for this moment. They understand that they represent 25 million French citizens whose voices have never been heard in government. When the Estates General opens with elaborate ceremonies at Versailles, Marie Antoinette appears in a magnificent gown of violet silk embroidered with silver thread. She wears a diamond tiara and carries herself with the regal bearing she's perfected over nearly 2 decades as queen. But her splendor creates exactly the wrong impression on representatives who have traveled to Versailles to address France's economic collapse. The Third Estate delegates stare at Marie Antoinette during the opening ceremony, calculating the cost of her jewels while they think about constituents who cannot afford bread. Her appearance confirms everything they believe about royal excess and aristocratic indifference. She becomes a living symbol of the inequality they've come to eliminate. The political crisis escalates rapidly after the Third Estate breaks away to form the National Assembly, declaring that they alone represent the true will of the French people. Louis XVI responds with his characteristic indecision, alternating between attempts at compromise and shows of force that satisfy nobody. Marie Antoinette pushes her husband toward a harder line, arguing that royal authority must be maintained at all costs. Her influence during these crucial weeks is both more and less significant than her critics claim. She does encourage Louis XVI to resist the National Assembly's demands, but her political advice is naive and counterproductive. She suggests using foreign troops to restore order, not understanding that this will make her appear even more like a foreign enemy of the French people. The situation explodes on July 14th, when Parisian crowds storm the Bastille fortress, seeking gunpowder for their weapons. This medieval prison has become a symbol of royal tyranny, though it actually holds only 7 prisoners when the mob arrives. The violence that follows marks the point of no return for the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette's reaction to the fall of the Bastille reveals how completely she misunderstands what's happening around her. When a courtier brings news of the event, she reportedly asks, "Is it a revolt?" When told that it's a revolution, she replies, "Then it is nothing." This exchange, whether real or invented, perfectly captures her inability to grasp the magnitude of change sweeping through France. The royal family's first instinct is to flee the country, but they hesitate too long. By the time they seriously consider escape, revolutionary guards are watching their every movement. Marie Antoinette begins burning letters and hiding jewelry, but she cannot bring herself to abandon the only life she's ever known. The March of Women on Versailles in October 1789 finally forces the royal family to confront their new reality. Thousands of Parisian women, desperate for bread and furious about royal indifference to their suffering, walk the 12 miles to Versailles, demanding action. They're armed with pikes, kitchen knives, and righteous anger that has been building for years. Marie Antoinette watches from her windows as this mob surrounds the palace, calling for her head and shouting the obscene songs about her that have circulated throughout Paris. The women below see her silhouette in the window and roar their disapproval, some throwing stones that shatter the glass around her. For the first time, she faces the raw hatred of the people she was supposed to serve. The crowd breaks into the palace during the night, seeking the Queen's private apartments. Guards barely manage to get Marie Antoinette to safety as the mob destroys her rooms, shredding her silk curtains and smashing her mirrors. They find her bed and stab it repeatedly with their weapons, imagining they're killing the woman they blame for their misery. When morning comes, the royal family appears on a balcony to face the crowd. Marie Antoinette stands between her 2 surviving children, trying to shield them from the hatred directed at their mother. The mob demands that she bow to them, acknowledging their power over her. After a long moment, she curtsies deeply, a gesture that saves her life, but destroys what remains of her royal dignity. The crowd forces the royal family to return with them to Paris, ending forever the isolation of Versailles. Marie Antoinette rides in a carriage surrounded by women, carrying the severed heads of her guards on pikes. The journey takes 6 hours, during which she maintains her composure while contemplating the faces of people who want to see her dead. Their new prison is the Tuileries Palace in central Paris, where they live under constant surveillance. Marie Antoinette's world shrinks from the vast expanses of Versailles to a few rooms overlooking a courtyard where crowds gather daily to shout insults at her windows. She can no longer walk in gardens or ride horses or host intimate gatherings with friends. Every letter she writes is read by revolutionary officials. Every visitor must be approved by the government that has made her their prisoner. The Queen spends her days teaching her children and planning escape attempts that grow increasingly desperate. She corresponds secretly with foreign courts, begging her relatives to invade France and restore the monarchy. These letters, when discovered, will provide the evidence revolutionaries need to charge her with treason. Marie Antoinette's relationship with her husband deteriorates under the stress of captivity. Louis XVI retreats into depression and overeating. gaining so much weight that he can barely walk. He stops making decisions entirely, leaving Marie Antoinette to negotiate with revolutionary leaders who view her as their primary enemy. The man who was never strong enough to be king becomes even weaker in crisis. Their son, Louis Charles, now the Dauphin after his older brother's death from tuberculosis, provides the only bright moments in their increasingly dark existence. The boy is 7 years old, beautiful and intelligent, unaware that he's living through the destruction of the world he was born to inherit. Marie Antoinette dotes on him, perhaps sensing that their time together is limited. The failed escape attempt to Varennes in June 1791 marks the beginning of the end for Marie Antoinette. The royal family almost reaches the Austrian border before being recognized and arrested. Louis XVI's hesitation and poor planning doom the effort, but Marie Antoinette receives most of the blame for pushing her family toward this desperate gamble. The journey back to Paris as prisoners rather than fugitives shows Marie Antoinette how completely her world has changed. Crowds line the roads, not to cheer their queen, but to jeer at her downfall. Children throw mud at her carriage. Adults shout threats and obscenities. The woman who once travelled these same roads as a celebrated bride now returns as a symbol of everything the French people have rejected. Back in Paris, the royal family faces a transformed political landscape. The moderate phase of the revolution is ending, replaced by radical leaders who see compromise with the monarchy as betrayal of the people's will. Marie Antoinette becomes the focus of increasingly violent rhetoric as revolutionaries compete to demonstrate their hatred of the old regime. The war that breaks out between France and Austria in 1792 provides the final excuse revolutionaries need to destroy Marie Antoinette completely. She's portrayed as an enemy agent, a woman whose loyalties lie with foreign powers rather than with France. The fact that she has indeed been corresponding with Austrian officials makes these charges seem credible, even though her treason consists mainly of desperate pleas for help rather than military intelligence. When the monarchy falls in August 1792, Marie Antoinette faces a future that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived in France as a 14-year-old bride. The woman who once commanded armies of servants now depends on revolutionary guards for her basic needs. The queen, who once wore different gowns every day, now owns only the clothes on her back. The mother, who once played at being a shepherdess, now watches real shepherds debate her fate in the National Convention. The temple prison where Marie Antoinette spends her final months is a medieval fortress that seems designed to crush the human spirit. Built in the 12th century by the Knights Templar, its thick stone walls have witnessed centuries of suffering, but none quite like what unfolds in the summer of 1792. The royal family is confined to the upper floors, their windows barred not just with iron, but with wooden planks that block out most of the sunlight. Marie Antoinette, who once commanded 300 rooms at Versailles, now shares cramped quarters with her husband and children under the constant watch of revolutionary guards. The guards assigned to the royal family are carefully chosen for their hatred of the monarchy. They take pleasure in small cruelties, forcing the former king to wear a red cap of liberty, making crude jokes about the queen's appearance, refusing to let the children play with toys deemed too luxurious for prisoners. One guard, a cobbler named Simon, delights in teaching young Louis Charles revolutionary songs that mock his parents. The boy, barely 8 years old, begins singing verses about how kings and queens should be hanged. Marie Antoinette watches her son absorb this poison with a mother's helpless rage. She tries to maintain some semblance of normal family life, creating lessons and games from whatever material she can find. When the guards confiscate her sewing supplies, claiming that needles could be weapons, she teaches her daughter Marie-Thérèse to embroider using threads pulled from their own clothing and thorns from the prison courtyard as needles. The psychological torture is relentless and calculated. Revolutionary newspapers are left where the royal family can read headlines about their impending trials and executions. Pamphlets describing Marie Antoinette's alleged crimes are posted on the prison walls. Guards discuss the sharpness of guillotine blades within earshot of the children, debating whether the device kills instantly or if victims remain conscious for several seconds after decapitation. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of their imprisonment is the false hope that periodically surfaces. Royalist agents make contact, promising rescue attempts that never materialize. Foreign governments send diplomatic notes suggesting they're working to secure the family's release. But these efforts collapse under the weight of European politics. Each failed possibility leaves Marie Antoinette more desperate and more isolated. The Queen's appearance changes dramatically during these months of captivity. Her famous blonde hair turns completely white, earning her the nickname the White Lady among the guards. She loses so much weight that her clothes hang loose on her frame. Dark circles appear under her eyes from sleepless nights spent listening for sounds of approaching mobs. The woman who once set fashion trends across Europe now looks decades older than her 37 years. Louis XVI faces his trial first, in December 1792. The proceedings are a foregone conclusion, but Marie Antoinette clings to the hope that her husband's obvious weakness and incompetence might save him. Surely the revolutionaries will see that this bumbling, indecisive man poses no threat to their new republic. She doesn't understand that weakness makes him more dangerous, not less, because it proves that monarchy itself is fundamentally flawed. The king's defense team tries to portray him as a reluctant ruler who inherited problems he never created. They present evidence of his attempts at reform, his support for the American Revolution, his genuine concern for his subjects' welfare. But the prosecutors have a more compelling narrative. Louis XVI is guilty not just of his own crimes, but of centuries of royal oppression. His execution will symbolically kill the entire feudal past that has kept the French people in chains. Marie Antoinette is not allowed to attend her husband's trial, but she hears the verdict through prison walls. On January 17, 1793, the National Convention votes to execute Louis XVI by a margin of 1 vote. The man who once ruled the most powerful nation in Europe will die like a common criminal, his head severed by the same machine used to kill thieves and murderers. The night before Louis XVI's execution, Marie Antoinette experiences what might be the most intimate moment of their entire marriage. For 23 years, they have been partners in a political arrangement, rarely alone together, constantly performing their roles for an audience of courtiers. Now, facing death, they finally speak to each other as simply husband and wife. Louis XVI tries to prepare his family for what's coming. He speaks to his son about forgiveness, explaining that hatred will only perpetuate the cycle of violence destroying France. He tells his daughter to pray for their enemies and to remember that nobility comes from character, not birth. To Marie Antoinette, he offers the closest thing to an apology their relationship will ever contain. He's sorry that loving her brought her to this place. The Queen spends that final night cutting locks of her husband's hair for their children, creating the only mementos they'll have of their father. She listens to him practice the speech he plans to give from the scaffold. Words about forgiveness and reconciliation that she knows will be drowned out by the crowd's bloodlust. When dawn comes, she watches from her barred window as he walks to the courtyard for the last time. The sound of the crowd gathering in the Place de la Révolution reaches the Temple prison, even though it's miles away. Marie Antoinette strains to hear individual voices in that roar, trying to understand the mood of the people who are about to kill her husband. At exactly 10:20 in the morning, she hears the cathedral bells of Paris ring out, signaling that Louis XVI is dead. The execution transforms Marie Antoinette from queen to widow, from political symbol to grieving woman. But the revolutionaries cannot allow her this human moment. Within hours of her husband's death, pamphlets appear on Paris streets celebrating the Austrian whore's loss and promising that she will soon join him. The machinery of propaganda that destroyed her reputation now focuses on building public support for her own execution. Maximilien Robespierre, the lawyer from provincial Arras, who has become the most powerful man in France, understands that Marie Antoinette's trial will be different from her husband's. Louis XVI was executed for his political crimes, real and imagined. Marie Antoinette must be destroyed for her symbolic crimes, her foreignness, her femininity, her sexuality, her materialism. She represents everything the revolution seeks to eliminate from French society. The charges being prepared against Marie Antoinette read like a catalogue of 18th century anxieties about women in power. She's accused of corrupting her husband, of teaching her children to hate France, of sending military secrets to Austria, of planning to escape with foreign gold while leaving French people to starve. Most damningly, she's charged with unnatural relationships with both men and women, crimes that supposedly prove her moral depravity. These sexual accusations are particularly vicious and effective because they tap into deep fears about female sexuality. In a world where women are supposed to be passive and pure, Marie Antoinette's alleged appetites mark her as a monster. The fact that she had children proves she's not frigid. The intensity of her friendships suggests she's not satisfied with normal relationships. Her influence over politics indicates she's not properly submissive to male authority. Marie Antoinette faces this character assassination from the isolation of her prison cell, unable to defend herself against accusations that spread faster than she can refute them. She writes desperate letters to her sister-in-law, trying to explain that the stories about her are lies. But these letters are intercepted and used as evidence of her continued plotting. Everything she does to save herself becomes proof of her guilt. The separation from her surviving children represents a torture designed specifically for her. Revolutionary officials understand that Marie Antoinette's maternal feelings are genuine, perhaps the only authentic emotion she's ever shown in public. They use this knowledge as a weapon, alternately threatening her children and offering to protect them in exchange for confessions. Young Louis Charles, now technically Louis XVII according to royalist supporters, becomes a particular focus of revolutionary attention. The boy has been traumatized by witnessing his father's arrest, his family's imprisonment, and the constant violence surrounding them. Revolutionary officials decide to re-educate him, removing him from his mother's influence and placing him with the cobbler Simon, who specializes in breaking aristocratic spirits. The psychological abuse inflicted on this 8-year-old child is systematic and horrifying. Simon forces him to wear the rough clothes of working-class children and to sleep on straw mattresses. He teaches him to curse his parents and to repeat revolutionary slogans. Most cruelly, he encourages the boy to make sexual accusations against his mother, coaching him in testimony that will be used at her trial. Marie Antoinette can hear her son's voice through the prison walls as Simon drills him in these rehearsed accusations. The woman who once worried about proper etiquette and fashionable hairstyles now experiences a mother's worst nightmare. Her own child being turned against her by people who understand exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. The Queen's health deteriorates rapidly under this stress. She develops severe hemorrhaging that prison doctors refuse weakens her further, but to provide adequate medical care. They claim her illness is psychosomatic, a ploy to win sympathy or delay her trial. In reality, the combination of poor nutrition, constant anxiety, and untreated medical conditions is slowly killing her. By the summer of 1793, Marie Antoinette barely resembles the woman who once dazzled European courts with her beauty and style. Her white hair has grown thin and brittle. Her face is gaunt from weight loss and marked by deep lines of suffering. Her hands, once soft and pampered, are now rough from doing her own washing and mending. The physical transformation mirrors her psychological journey from pampered queen to desperate prisoner. The political situation outside the Temple prison grows more radical and chaotic as the revolution devours its own children Girondins who, The moderate, initially supported constitutional monarchy are purged and executed by the more extreme Jacobins. The Jacobins then split into competing factions that hunt each other with the same ferocity they once reserved for aristocrats. Each group tries to prove its revolutionary purity by demanding harsher measures against surviving enemies of the people. Marie Antoinette becomes a test case for revolutionary justice. Moderate voices suggest that executing a widow and mother might damage the Republic's moral authority, especially since she wielded no real political power. But radical leaders argue that showing mercy to the Austrian woman would betray everyone who died fighting the monarchy. They need her death to prove that the revolution is irreversible. The trial preparations reveal how completely the revolutionaries have abandoned any pretense of actual justice. The prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, admits privately that the verdict is predetermined and that the proceedings are simply theatre designed to justify an execution already decided upon. Witnesses are coached in their testimony, evidence is fabricated, and legal procedures are manipulated to ensure the desired outcome. Marie Antoinette learns about these preparations through the prison network of guards, servants, and visitors who still feel some sympathy for her plight. She understands that her trial will be a show trial, but she still hopes that speaking truthfully might save her life or at least preserve her reputation for her surviving children. She spends her remaining weeks in the Temple prison, preparing her defense, writing notes about events she wants to clarify and accusations she hopes to refute. The irony of her situation would be comic if it weren't so tragic. The woman accused of manipulating French politics from behind the scenes actually has no political experience or skills. She's preparing to defend herself against charges of masterminding complex conspiracies when she can barely understand the legal system that's trying her. Her naivety, which once seemed charming in a queen, now appears pathetic in a defendant facing death. The transfer from the Temple prison to the Conciergerie in August 1793 marks the beginning of Marie Antoinette's final ordeal. The Conciergerie is where condemned prisoners spend their last days before execution, a medieval dungeon beneath the Palace of Justice, where hundreds of aristocrats have already awaited their turns at the guillotine. The cell they assign to Marie Antoinette is 6 feet by 9 feet, with a single window that provides just enough light to read the graffiti left by previous occupants. This tiny space becomes her entire world for the next 11 weeks. A straw mattress on the floor serves as her bed. A wooden table and chair constitute her only furniture. A screen provides minimal privacy from the guards who watch her constantly, recording her every word and gesture for the prosecutors building their case against her. The conditions are deliberately humiliating, designed to break whatever dignity she has left. She's forced to dress and undress in front of male guards who make crude comments about her body. Her meals consist of thin soup and stale bread, barely enough nutrition to sustain life. She's allowed 1 hour of exercise per day in a courtyard where other prisoners can see and mock her. But perhaps the worst aspect of her confinement is the psychological isolation. Marie Antoinette, who spent her entire adult life surrounded by people, now faces the prospect of death essentially alone. The few visitors allowed to see her are interrogated afterward about their conversations. Letters to her children are censored or destroyed. She's cut off from any source of comfort or hope except her own inner resources, which have never been tested in circumstances like these. The Queen uses her final weeks to write what amounts to her spiritual testament, a letter to her sister-in-law that reveals a side of her character that few people ever glimpsed during her years of prosperity. She writes about forgiveness, explaining that she doesn't hate the people who are about to kill her because they've been deceived by propaganda and driven to extremes by their own suffering. She expresses regret for the mistakes she made as queen, acknowledging that her lifestyle contributed to the resentment that destroyed the monarchy. Most movingly, she writes about her children, trying to leave them guidance for lives she knows she won't share. She tells her daughter to be strong but not bitter, to remember her father's example of forgiveness rather than her mother's example of suffering. She writes to her son, wherever he might be, explaining that true nobility comes from serving others rather than expecting to be served by them. These letters reveal Marie Antoinette finally becoming the person she might have been if circumstances had been different. The frivolous young woman who played at being a shepherdess has been replaced by a mature woman who understands suffering and accepts responsibility for her mistakes. The transformation comes too late to save her life, but it redeems her character in ways that her critics will never acknowledge. The trial itself, which begins on October 14th, 1793, is everything she expected. A predetermined farce designed to justify a decision already made. The prosecutors present their case with theatrical flourishes, describing Marie Antoinette as a monster whose crimes against the French people demand the ultimate punishment. They call witnesses who testify to events they never witnessed and present documents they know are forged. Marie Antoinette's defense is hampered by lawyers who have been given almost no time to prepare and who understand that vigorous advocacy might mark them as enemies of the people. They do their best to challenge the evidence and question the witnesses, but they're fighting against the tide of revolutionary fervour that has already decided their client's fate. The Queen herself provides the most compelling moments of the trial. Speaking clearly and directly, she denies the charges against her and explains her actions during the crucial years of the revolution. Her testimony is dignified and convincing, revealing a woman who made mistakes, but never committed the monstrous crimes attributed to her. She admits to corresponding with foreign courts, but explains that she was seeking her family, not betray help forging French military secrets. When present prosecutors the coach testimony of her son, accusing her of sexual abuse and corruption, Marie Antoinette's composure finally breaks. She declares that nature recoils from such accusations against a mother, that no woman could be guilty of the crimes they're describing. This moment of genuine emotion cuts through the theatrical atmosphere of the courtroom, but it doesn't change the predetermined outcome. The verdict comes after 2 days of testimony that convince no one and change nothing. Marie Antoinette is found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. She receives the news with the same dignity she's maintained throughout her ordeal, simply asking when the sentence will be carried out. When told it will be the next morning, she nods and requests time to write final letters to her children. The last night of Marie Antoinette's life reveals the complete transformation of a woman who began as a frivolous teenager and ends as a figure of tragic dignity. She spends hours writing letters she knows will probably never reach their intended recipients, trying to leave some record of the love she feels for the children she's being forced to abandon. Her letter to Marie-Thérèse is particularly heartbreaking as she tries to prepare a teenage daughter for a life without parents or prospects. She writes about the importance of forgiveness, explaining that hatred will only perpetuate the violence that has destroyed their family. She encourages her daughter to be strong, but not bitter, to find ways to serve others even if she can never reclaim her royal status. To her son, she writes about the responsibilities of leadership, even though she knows he may never have the chance to lead anything. She explains that true nobility comes from character rather than birth, that kings and queens are only as good as their service to their people. She asks him to forgive the men who are killing his parents and to work for reconciliation rather than revenge. Marie Antoinette spends her final hours in prayer and reflection, preparing herself spiritually for the death she's about to face. She writes in her prayer book about accepting God's will and finding meaning in suffering. The woman who once seemed to care only for pleasure and luxury now demonstrates a depth of faith and character that her enemies will never acknowledge. As dawn approaches on October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette prepares for her final public appearance. She dresses in a simple white gown, the colour of mourning for French queens, and covers her white hair with a plain cap. She refuses the rouge that might hide her pale complexion, wanting to face death with the dignity that has sustained her through these final months of ordeal. The executioner arrives at 8 in the morning to cut her hair and bind her hands behind her back. She submits to these preparations with the composure of someone who has already died inside. who has spent weeks mentally rehearsing this moment. When they lead her from her cell for the last time, she walks steadily despite her physical weakness. Ready it's her in the streets to face whatever awa of Paris. The cart that carries Marie Antoinette through the streets of Paris is deliberately chosen to humiliate her one final time. Unlike the ornate carriages that once transported her to balls and operas, this rough wooden vehicle is used for common criminals. Her hands are bound so tightly behind her back that the rope cuts into her wrists, drawing blood that stains her white dress. She sits upright despite the jolting motion, refusing to give the crowds lining the streets the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. The route from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution takes 45 minutes, but for Marie Antoinette it must feel like a lifetime. Every face in the crowd belongs to someone who hates her, someone who believes the propaganda that transformed her from a person into a symbol of oppression. Children who should be inautumn fruit at her cart school instead throw R. Women who might have daughters her age scream for her blood with voices hoarse from shouting. What strikes observers most forcefully is her composure during this final journey. The priest riding beside her later writes that she maintained perfect dignity throughout the ordeal, never crying out or pleading for mercy. When the cart hits a particularly deep pothole and she's thrown against the wooden sides, she straightens herself without complaint. When someone in the crowd shouts an obscenity about her dead husband, she doesn't even turn her head. The crowds grow thicker and more violent as they approach the execution site. The Place de la Révolution, once called the Place Louis XV in honor of her husband's grandfather, now serves as the Republic's primary killing ground. The guillotine stands in the center like a grotesque altar, its blade gleaming in the October sunlight. Around it, wooden bleachers have been erected for spectators willing to pay premium prices for the best views of the Austrian queen's death. Jacques-Louis David, the revolutionary painter, positions himself near the scaffold with his sketchbook, planning to capture Marie Antoinette's final moments for posterity. His drawing will show a woman aged beyond her 37 years, her face gaunt and her expression resigned. But what his artistic eye captures that the bloodthirsty crowd misses is the fundamental dignity she maintains even in these final minutes of her life. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, has presided over hundreds of executions since the revolution began, but he later admits that Marie Antoinette's death affects him differently. She shows no fear as she climbs the steps to the scaffold, even though her bound hands make the ascent awkward and dangerous. When she accidentally steps on his foot while positioning herself for the blade, she automatically says, "Pardon, monsieur," the reflexive courtesy of someone raised to consider others even in extremity. This moment of politeness toward her executioner becomes one of the most telling details of Marie Antoinette's final minutes. Here is a woman who has spent 11 weeks in a dungeon, who has been separated from her children and subjected to a show trial, who faces death by decapitation in front of a mob that celebrates her suffering. Yet her instinct is still to apologize for a minor discourtesy to the man about to kill her. The crowd falls strangely quiet as Marie Antoinette positions herself beneath the blade. For months they have imagined this moment, anticipated the satisfaction of watching their enemy die. But confronted with the reality of a middle-aged woman facing death with such composure, some begin to feel uncomfortable about their bloodlust. This isn't the monster described in revolutionary pamphlets. This is simply a human being about to be killed. Marie Antoinette uses these final seconds to scan the crowd, perhaps looking for a friendly face among the sea of hatred. She finds none, but her expression doesn't change. She has already said goodbye to her children in letters they may never receive. She has already forgiven her enemies in prayers they will never hear. She has already made peace with a God who allowed her to suffer, but also gave her the strength to endure that suffering with grace. The blade falls at 12:15 in the afternoon, severing Marie Antoinette's head with the mechanical precision that has made the guillotine the revolution's weapon of choice. The executioner's assistant holds up her head for the crowd to see, and the assembled masses roar their approval. But the celebration feels hollow, anticlimactic. After years of building hatred toward this woman, her actual death resolves nothing and satisfies no one. What the crowd doesn't understand is that they have just witnessed something unprecedented in the history of royal executions. Marie Antoinette dies not as a queen clinging to her privileges, but as a woman who has transcended her origins through suffering. The frivolous teenager who arrived from Austria 23 years earlier has been transformed by adversity into someone capable of facing death with a courage that shames her executioners. The immediate aftermath of Marie Antoinette's execution reveals the hollowness of revolutionary justice. Her body is thrown into an unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, covered with quicklime to speed decomposition. Her head is sewn back onto her corpse, but no ceremony marks her burial. The woman who once commanded elaborate funeral rites for her pet dogs is disposed of like a criminal, her remains mixed with those of hundreds of other execution victims. Her children, the supposed beneficiaries of this revolutionary justice, are left more vulnerable than before. Marie-Thérèse remains imprisoned in the temple, now completely alone except for guards who treat her with increasing Louis brutality. Her brother, psychological Charles, continues his torture under the cobbler Simon, who forces him to celebrate his mother's death while teaching him to curse her memory. The revolution that claimed to protect children from royal corruption instead destroys the innocence of the very children it pretended to save. The European response to Marie Antoinette's execution is swift and horrified. Her brother, Emperor Francis II of Austria, uses her death to justify a massive military campaign against revolutionary France. Her former mother-in-law, Maria Carolina, Queen of Naples, becomes one of the most implacable enemies of the French Republic. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate revolutionary justice instead creates new enemies and prolongs the wars that will devastate Europe for the next 20 years. But perhaps most tragically, Marie Antoinette's death changes nothing about the problems that caused the peas the first place. French Revolution in struggle ants still to feed their families. French workers still lack political representation. French society still suffers from the inequality and injustice that made revolution inevitable. The execution of one woman, however symbolic, cannot solve the economic and social problems that took centuries to create. The propaganda machine that destroyed Marie Antoinette's reputation continues operating after her death, now focused on justifying the execution rather than demanding it. Revolutionary newspapers publish detailed accounts of her supposed crimes, complete with fabricated quotes and imaginary confessions. These stories become the basis for historical accounts that will shape her reputation for generations, ensuring that the lies told about her in life become accepted truths after her death. Maximilien Robespierre, the man most responsible for Marie Antoinette's execution, survives her by less than 10 months. The same revolutionary machinery that destroyed the Queen eventually turns on its creators, consuming Robespierre and his followers with the same ruthless efficiency. His own execution in July 1794 marks the end of the terror, but it comes too late to save the thousands of victims, including Marie Antoinette, who died to satisfy the revolution's appetite for blood. The executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, who presided over both Marie Antoinette's death and Robespierre's, later reflects on the irony of revolutionary justice. The people who demanded the Queen's head in the name of liberty and equality eventually faced the same blade themselves, victims of the system they created. The revolution that began by promising to end arbitrary executions becomes history's most systematic killing machine, destroying its own children, along with its declared enemies. Marie Antoinette's final letter to her sister-in-law, written hours before her execution, eventually reaches its destination despite revolutionary censorship. In it, she writes about forgiveness and reconciliation, themes that seem impossible given the circumstances of her death. She expresses hope that her suffering might somehow contribute to France's eventual healing, that her death might satisfy the revolutionary bloodlust and allow the country to find peace. This hope proves tragically naive. The execution of Marie Antoinette doesn't end the terror, it accelerates it. Having proven their willingness to kill a queen, revolutionary leaders find it easier to justify killing anyone who opposes them. The months following her death see an unprecedented escalation of violence as the revolution devours ever wider circles of supposed enemies. The fate of Marie Antoinette's surviving children illustrates the revolution's failure to create the better world it promised. Marie-Thérèse spends 3 more years in prison, watching her health deteriorate and her spirit break under conditions designed to destroy her sanity. When she's finally released in 1795, she's a traumatized young woman who will never fully recover from her experiences. Her brother, Louis Charles, dies in 1795, probably from tuberculosis. But his death is so surrounded by secrecy and conflicting accounts that conspiracy theories persist for decades. The revolution that claimed to protect children from royal corruption instead subjects royal children to systematic abuse that would be considered torture by any civilized standard. The boy who might have become a constitutional monarch dies in a prison cell, his potential for good or evil snuffed out by people who claimed to act in the name of justice and humanity. Marie Antoinette's execution also reveals the revolution's fundamental misunderstanding of political power. Revolutionary leaders believed that killing the queen would somehow eliminate the social forces that supported monarchy. But symbolic gestures cannot change underlying economic and social realities. The problems that made revolution necessary, poverty, inequality, and political oppression, continue long after the last royal head falls. The international consequences of Marie Antoinette's death extend far beyond the immediate military responses of her relatives. Her execution convinces European monarchs that revolutionary France represents an existential threat to their entire way of life. What began as a French internal affair becomes a continental war that will reshape European politics for generations. The wars, sparked partly by outrage over Marie Antoinette's death, eventually bring Napoleon Bonaparte to power, creating a new form of authoritarianism that makes the old monarchy seem mild by comparison. The revolution that promised liberty, equality, and fraternity instead produces military dictatorship, continental warfare, and suffering on a scale that dwarfs anything experienced under the old regime. Yet even as revolutionary France descends into chaos and violence, the example of Marie Antoinette's dignity in death begins to reshape European attitudes toward royal executions. Future revolutionaries will find it harder to justify killing monarchs who face death with such composure and grace. Her final moments become a template for royal martyrdom that influences political movements across Europe for the next century. The economic problems that helped cause the French Revolution persist throughout the revolutionary period and beyond. The execution of Marie Antoinette doesn't make bread cheaper or create jobs for unemployed workers. The revolutionary government proves no more capable than the monarchy of solving France's fundamental economic problems, and in many cases makes them worse through war and political instability. The social divisions that the revolution promised to eliminate actually deepen in many ways after Marie Antoinette's death. The new revolutionary elite proves as corrupt and self-serving as the old aristocracy, enriching themselves while ordinary French people continue to suffer. The execution of the Queen becomes a symbol of revolutionary hypocrisy rather than revolutionary justice. Marie Antoinette's death also marks a turning point in European attitudes toward women in politics. Her execution is used to justify excluding women from political participation, with revolutionary leaders arguing that female involvement in politics inevitably leads to corruption and disaster. The revolution that promises equality for all citizens instead establishes new forms of gender discrimination that will persist for generations. The propaganda techniques used to destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation become a template for future political campaigns. The combination of sexual innuendo, xenophobic appeals, and class resentment that proved so effective against her will be recycled by demagogues throughout European history. Her destruction pioneers modern methods of character assassination that remain relevant today. But perhaps most significantly, Marie Antoinette's execution demonstrates the power of narrative to override facts in political discourse. The story told about her, a frivolous foreign queen who bankrupted France while her people starved, becomes more powerful than the historical reality of a woman who wielded little actual political power and made genuine efforts to help her subjects. The lies told about her prove more influential than any truths. The transformation of Marie Antoinette from a real person into a political symbol begins even before her death and accelerates rapidly afterward. Revolutionary propaganda creates a fictional version of the Queen that serves the political needs of her enemies. And this fictional character eventually replaces the historical Marie Antoinette in popular memory. The process by which Marie Antoinette becomes a scapegoat for France's problems reveals how societies use individuals to embody their collective anxieties and frustrations. She becomes responsible not just for her own mistakes, but for centuries of royal abuse, economic mismanagement, and social injustice. Her death is supposed to expiate these historical sins and create space for a better future. The failure of Marie Antoinette's execution to solve any of France's actual problems highlights the limitations of symbolic politics. Killing scapegoats may provide emotional satisfaction, but it doesn't address the underlying issues that create social and political problems. The Queen's death becomes a distraction from the hard work of building better institutions and solving complex economic challenges. The international ramifications of Marie Antoinette's execution continue reverberating throughout European politics for decades. Her death convinces many European rulers that compromise with revolutionary movements is impossible, leading to more rigid and repressive policies that actually increase the likelihood of future revolutions. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate the power of popular sovereignty instead strengthens conservative reaction across Europe. The religious dimensions of Marie Antoinette's execution also prove significant in shaping European attitudes toward the French Revolution. Her dignified death and expressions of forgiveness for her enemies create a narrative of Christian martyrdom that resonates with Catholic populations across Europe. Revolutionary France's treatment of the Queen becomes evidence of the revolution's godless character and helps mobilize religious opposition to republican ideals. The impact on French society itself is equally profound and long-lasting. Marie Antoinette's execution establishes precedents for political violence that will haunt France for generations. The ease with which revolutionary leaders justify killing their enemies creates a political culture where violence becomes an acceptable solution to political disagreements. The children who witness Marie Antoinette's execution, either in person or through the graphic descriptions that circulate afterward, grow up in a society where public killing is entertainment and political murder is justice. This normalization of violence shapes an entire generation and contributes to the ongoing instability that will characterize French politics for decades. The economic consequences of the revolutionary period, including the wars partly triggered by Marie Antoinette's execution, create lasting damage to French prosperity. The country that was Europe's wealthiest before 1789 emerges from the revolutionary period impoverished and exhausted, its population depleted by war, and its economy disrupted by political chaos. Marie Antoinette's execution thus becomes not just the end of one woman's tragic story, but a turning point in European and world history. Her death marks the moment when the old world of monarchy and aristocracy begins its final transformation into the modern world of nationalism and popular sovereignty. The dignified way she faces death cannot save her life, but it helps preserve some notion of human dignity in an age increasingly characterized by mass violence and ideological extremism. The ultimate irony of Marie Antoinette's story is that her death makes her more powerful than she ever was in life. The living queen wielded little real political influence and made few lasting contributions to French history, But the martyred queen becomes a symbol that shapes European politics for generations, inspiring both revolutionary movements and conservative reactions that continue influencing world events long after her execution. Her final moments on the scaffold, facing death with grace and dignity while her enemies celebrate, create an image that transcends the political circumstances of her time. Marie Antoinette's composure in the face of hatred and violence becomes a testament to the possibility of maintaining humanity, even in inhuman circumstances. The woman who began life as an Austrian archduchess and briefly ruled as Queen of France ultimately becomes something more universal, a symbol of how individual human beings can transcend their circumstances through courage and dignity. Her transformation from frivolous teenager to tragic heroine occurs not through political achievement, but through moral growth in the face of suffering. Marie Antoinette's story thus becomes not just a tale of political revolution, but a meditation on the nature of human character under extreme pressure. The gilded cage of Versailles that trapped her in luxury and isolation ultimately prepared her, in ways no one could have predicted, for the spiritual challenges she would face in her final months of imprisonment and trial. The guillotine that ended her life could not destroy the example she set in facing death, with forgiveness rather than hatred, dignity rather than despair. In this sense, Marie Antoinette achieves in death the kind of moral victory that eluded her throughout her troubled reign as queen. The woman who never learned to be an effective political leader ultimately teaches lessons about human resilience and grace that prove more enduring than any political achievement. The transformation of Marie Antoinette from a living person into an eternal symbol began even before her body grew cold in that unmarked grave. Within hours of her execution, the printing presses of Paris were working overtime, producing commemorative pamphlets that celebrated the death of the Austrian whore, while simultaneously creating new myths about her final moments. Some claimed she had begged for mercy, others that she had cursed the French people with her dying breath. None of these accounts were true, but truth had ceased to matter in the revolutionary fever that gripped France. The real Marie Antoinette, the woman who had apologized to her executioner for stepping on his foot, was already disappearing beneath layers of propaganda and political necessity. The revolutionaries needed her to remain a monster even in death, because acknowledging her dignity would undermine the entire narrative they had constructed to justify her execution. If Marie Antoinette could face death with such grace, what did that say about the people who had demanded her blood? But the most devastating consequence of her execution wasn't political or international. It was personal, intimate, and played out in the dark corridors of the Temple prison, where her surviving children continued their own slow destruction. Marie-Thérèse, now completely alone at 16, began showing signs of the psychological damage that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The girl who had once been destined to marry into European royalty now spent her days in a cell, watched by guards who took pleasure in describing how her mother had died. The treatment of young Louis Charles became even more systematic and cruel after his mother's death. The cobbler Simon, emboldened by the revolutionary government's approval of his methods, intensified his efforts to break the boy's spirit completely. He forced the child to sing songs celebrating his mother's execution, to curse her memory, and to repeat the sexual accusations that had been used at her trial. The boy, who might have grown up to be a constitutional monarch, was being deliberately destroyed by people who claimed to act in the name of protecting children. What makes Louis Charles's story particularly heartbreaking is that he had genuinely loved his mother. Before their imprisonment, witnesses had observed the close bond between Marie Antoinette and her youngest son. She had taught him to read, played games with him in the gardens of Versailles, protected him from the worst aspects of court life. Now that same love was being weaponized against him, turned into a source of shame and self-hatred. The boy's physical health deteriorated as rapidly as his mental state. The damp conditions in the Temple prison, combined with poor nutrition and constant stress, weakened his immune system. He developed a persistent cough that the prison doctors ignored, claiming it was another attempt to gain sympathy. By the winter of 1794, less than a year after his mother's death, Louis Charles was showing signs of the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. Meanwhile, across Europe, Marie Antoinette's relatives were discovering that her execution had made their own positions more precarious, not more secure. Her brother, Emperor Francis II, found himself fighting an increasingly desperate war against French revolutionary armies that seemed to grow stronger with each victory. The Austrian military, once the most feared in Europe, proved no match for French soldiers motivated by revolutionary fervour and led by generals who had risen through merit rather than birth. The irony was crushing. Marie Antoinette had spent years writing letters to her Austrian family, begging them to invade France and restore the monarchy. Now that invasion was finally coming, but it was too late to save her and too weak to defeat the revolution she had inadvertently helped to radicalize. Every Austrian victory on the battlefield was met by increased repression in Paris, where anyone suspected of royalist sympathies faced the guillotine. Her sister Maria Carolina, Queen of Naples, responded to Marie Antoinette's death with a fury that bordered on madness. She had always been the more politically astute of the two sisters, and she understood immediately that the execution represented a fundamental shift in European politics. If revolutionaries could kill one queen with impunity, no monarch anywhere was safe. She began organizing coalitions and funding counter-revolutionary activities with a single-minded determination that would eventually consume her own kingdom. But perhaps the most unexpected consequence of Marie Antoinette's execution was its effect on the revolutionary leadership itself. Maximilien Robespierre, who had orchestrated her death as a symbol of revolutionary justice, began to experience doubts that would ultimately contribute to his own downfall. He had expected her execution to unite the French people behind the revolution, but instead, it seemed to deepen divisions and increase political instability. The problem was that Marie Antoinette's dignified death had created a narrative that competed with revolutionary propaganda. Stories of her composure on the scaffold, her final letters expressing forgiveness, and her refusal to show fear in the face of death were circulating despite government censorship. These accounts made her seem more like a Christian martyr than a political criminal, and they began to influence public opinion in ways that worried revolutionary leaders. Robespierre found himself in the impossible position of having to justify increasingly extreme measures to maintain the revolution's momentum. If killing Marie Antoinette hadn't solved France's problems, then perhaps more executions were needed. If the Queen's death hadn't satisfied the people's hunger for justice, then perhaps more blood would. This logic led inevitably to the Great Terror, the period of mass executions that would claim thousands of lives before finally consuming Robespierre himself. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, who had presided over Marie Antoinette's death, began to understand that he had become the instrument of something far larger and more destructive than simple justice. Each day brought new victims to his scaffold, people whose only crime was being born into the wrong class or holding the Queen, was now devouring France the wrong political opinions. The machine that had killed itself. Sanson later wrote in his memoirs about the strange atmosphere that surrounded royal executions compared to those of common criminals. When he killed thieves and murderers, the crowds cheered with genuine satisfaction, feeling that justice had been served. But when he killed aristocrats, especially women like Marie Antoinette, the celebration felt forced and hollow. People cheered because they thought they were supposed to, not because they felt genuine joy. The economic situation that had helped trigger the revolution continued to deteriorate throughout 1794 and beyond. Marie Antoinette's death hadn't made bread cheaper or created jobs for unemployed workers. If anything, the ongoing wars and political chaos were making life harder for ordinary French people. The revolution that had promised to solve their problems was instead creating new ones, and the Queen's execution was beginning to look less like justice and more like cynic enthusiasm for the Republican newspapers tried to maintain a Guillotine. revolutionary cause by publishing increasingly elaborate accounts of Marie Antoinette's supposed crimes. They described secret chambers in Versailles, where she had allegedly plotted against France, hidden correspondence with enemy agents, and orgies that had corrupted the entire court. These stories grew more fantastic with each telling, as if the propagandists understood that reality wasn't dramatic enough to justify what they had done. The international community's response to Marie Antoinette's execution was swift and almost universally condemnatory. Even governments that had no love for the French monarchy were disturbed by the precedent of executing a queen in such a public and theatrical manner. The execution seemed to represent a breakdown of the civilized norms that governed relationships between European states. Catherine the Great of Russia, herself no stranger to political violence, was reportedly horrified by the details of Marie Antoinette's death. She had seized power through a coup that resulted in her husband's murder, but that violence had been private and quickly forgotten. The public spectacle of the French Queen's execution seemed to Catherine like a dangerous new form of political theatre that could inspire similar scenes across Europe. The British government, already at war with revolutionary France, used Marie Antoinette's execution as proof that the French revolutionaries were enemies of civilized society. British propaganda depicted her as an innocent victim of mob violence, conveniently forgetting their own history of executing monarchs. The execution became a rallying cry for British resistance to French expansion and helped justify years of warfare that would drain both nations' treasuries. Even in America, where revolutionary ideals might have been expected to create sympathy for the French Republic, Marie Antoinette's execution was generally condemned. George Washington, who had benefited from French support during the American Revolution, privately expressed disgust at the treatment of the royal family. The American revolutionaries had fought for independence, not for the right to murder women and children. The Spanish court, closely related to the French royal family through marriage alliances, responded to Marie Antoinette's death with a mixture of horror and fear. If revolutionaries could kill the Queen of France, what would stop them from crossing the Pyrenees and threatening the Spanish monarchy? This fear led to increasingly repressive policy in Spain and contributed to the political instability that would plague the country for decades. But it was in the German states where Marie Antoinette's execution had perhaps its most profound impact. As an Austrian archduchess, she was seen as a German princess who had been murdered by French radicals. Her death became a symbol of French aggression against German culture and helped fuel the nationalism that would eventually unite the German states against Napoleon. The Holy Roman Emperor, Marie Antoinette's nephew, Francis II, found his entire worldview shaken by his aunt's execution. The old system of European balance, where disputes between monarchs were settled through diplomacy and limited warfare, seemed to be collapsing. The French revolutionaries weren't playing by the traditional rules, and their willingness to execute royalty suggested they wouldn't respect any of the conventions that had governed European politics for centuries. Meanwhile, in the shadows of European society, a new generation of revolutionaries was studying the French example and drawing their own conclusions about the use of political violence. Marie Antoinette's execution became a precedent that would inspire radicals across Europe for generations. If French revolutionaries could kill their queen and survive, then perhaps other monarchies were more vulnerable than they appeared. The Catholic Church's response to Marie Antoinette's death was particularly significant in shaping European opinion. The Church had already declared the French Revolution anathema because of its attacks on clerical property and religious authority. The Queen's execution, combined with her reported piety in her final months, allowed the Church to present her as a Christian martyr, killed by godless revolutionaries. This religious dimension of Marie Antoinette's story proved more powerful than any political argument. Across Catholic Europe, priests delivered sermons comparing her suffering to that of early Christian martyrs. Her letters expressing forgiveness for her enemies were read as examples of Christian virtue triumphing over political hatred. The woman, who had been criticized for her frivolity in life, became a symbol of religious devotion in death. The impact on European women was particularly complex and lasting. Marie Antoinette's execution seemed to demonstrate the dangers that awaited women who became involved in politics, even indirectly. The vicious sexual accusations made against her during her trial became a template for attacking any woman who sought political influence. Her death was used to justify excluding women from political participation for generations. Yet at the same time, the dignity with which she faced death became an inspiration for women facing their own struggles. Her final letters, with their emphasis on forgiveness and moral courage, were copied and circulated among women across Europe. She became a model of how to maintain grace and dignity under extreme pressure, a lesson that transcended political boundaries. The literary and artistic response to Marie Antoinette's execution began almost immediately and continued for decades. Romantic poets and novelists found in her story all the elements of perfect tragedy: a beautiful heroine, an exotic setting, political intrigue, and a noble death. Her transformation from historical person to literary character helped shape European culture's understanding of the French Revolution. Writers like Edmund Burke in England used Marie Antoinette's fate as evidence that the revolution represented a fundamental attack on civilization itself. His famous lament that "the age of chivalry is gone" was inspired partly by her execution and helped define conservative opposition to revolutionary ideals throughout Europe. Her death became a symbol of everything that was being lost in the modern world's violent birth. The visual artists who had once competed to paint Marie Antoinette's portrait now turned their attention to depicting her suffering and death. Jacques Louis David's sketch of her final journey to the scaffold became one of the most famous images of the revolutionary period, but it was followed by dozens of paintings showing her as a tragic heroine rather than a political criminal. These artistic representations helped rehabilitate her image even as revolutionary propaganda continued attacking her memory. The psychological impact on those who had known Marie Antoinette personally was profound and lasting. The few courtiers who survived the revolution carried with them memories of a woman who bore little resemblance to the monster described in revolutionary pamphlets. Their testimonies, published years later when it became safe to defend her memory, revealed the complex personality that had been hidden beneath layers of propaganda and political necessity. Madame Campan, who had served as Marie Antoinette's first lady-in-waiting, eventually wrote detailed memoirs that presented a very different picture of the Queen. She described a woman who was generous to her servants, devoted to her children, and genuinely concerned about the suffering of ordinary French people. These accounts helped begin the slow process of historical rehabilitation that would eventually restore some balance to Marie Antoinette's reputation. The impact on the surviving members of the French royal family was equally profound. Those who escaped into exile carried with them not just grief for their murdered relatives, but guilt about their own survival. Many spent the rest of their lives plotting restoration attempts that they knew were probably hopeless, driven by a sense of obligation to avenge Marie Antoinette's death and restore the honor of their family. The Count of Provence, Louis XVI's brother, who would eventually become King Louis XVIII, never forgave the French people for what they had done to his sister-in-law. His eventual restoration in 1814 was marked by a coldness and suspicion toward his subjects that stemmed partly from his memories of Marie Antoinette's suffering. The revolution's violence had created wounds that would take generations to heal. Even among the revolutionaries themselves, Marie Antoinette's execution began to seem problematic as the initial enthusiasm of 1793 gave way to exhaustion and reflection. Those who had demanded her death found themselves questioning whether it had been necessary or just. The revolution that had promised to create a better world seemed instead to have unleashed forces that no one could control. The problem was that Marie Antoinette's execution had established a precedent for political murder that proved impossible to limit. If killing the Queen was justified, then killing anyone who opposed the revolution could be justified using the same logic. The machinery of death that had claimed her life continued operating with increasing efficiency, consuming revolutionaries and royalists alike. By the time Robespierre himself faced the guillotine in July 1794, many French people were beginning to understand that the revolution had gone too far. The execution of Marie Antoinette, once seen as the triumph of popular justice, now looked like the beginning of a nightmare that had nearly destroyed France. Her dignified death began to seem more admirable than the bloodthirsty crowds that had demanded it. The economic consequences of the revolutionary period, including the massive costs of the wars triggered partly by European outrage over royal executions, continued to burden France for decades. The country that had been bankrupted by the monarchy's debts found itself even more deeply in debt after years of revolutionary warfare. Marie Antoinette's execution hadn't solved any of the financial problems that had helped cause the revolution in the first place. The social transformation promised by the revolution also proved more limited than its supporters had hoped. The execution of aristocrats like Marie Antoinette hadn't eliminated inequality or injustice from French society. New elites emerged to replace the old ones, often proving just as corrupt and self-serving as the nobles they had displaced. The revolution had changed the players, but not the fundamental rules of the game. The international system that emerged from the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars was shaped significantly by the precedent of Marie Antoinette's execution. European monarchs became more suspicious of reform movements and more willing to use repression to maintain their authority. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate the power of popular sovereignty instead strengthened conservative reaction across the continent. The religious revival that swept through Europe in the early 19th century was also influenced by Marie Antoinette's fate. Her transformation into a Christian martyr helped fuel a broader reaction against the rationalism and materialism associated with the French Revolution. Churches across Europe used her story to illustrate the dangers of abandoning traditional religious values. The feminist movements that would emerge later in the 19th century had to grapple with the complex legacy of Marie Antoinette's execution. On one hand, the vicious attacks on her character demonstrated the particular vulnerability of women in political life. On the other hand, her courage in facing death provided an inspiring example of female strength under pressure. The development of modern journalism and mass media was also influenced by the techniques used to destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation. The combination of sexual innuendo, xenophobic appeals, and class resentment that proved so effective against her became standard tools in the political propagandist's arsenal. Her character assassination pioneered methods that remain depressingly familiar in modern political discourse. The evolution of Marie Antoinette's historical reputation reflects broader changes in European attitudes toward the French Revolution. During the 19th century, as the immediate passions of the revolutionary period cooled, historians began to take a more balanced view of her life and death. The monster created by revolutionary propaganda gradually gave way to a more complex understanding of a woman trapped by circumstances largely beyond her control. The Romantic movement in literature and art found in Marie Antoinette's story a perfect embodiment of their ideals about beauty, suffering, and tragic nobility. Writers like Alexandre Dumas and artists like Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun helped create a new image of the Queen as a romantic heroine rather than a political villain. This cultural rehabilitation proceeded alongside scholarly efforts to separate historical fact from revolutionary fiction. The 20th century brought new perspectives on Marie Antoinette's story, as historians gained access to previously secret archives and began to understand the full complexity of the revolutionary period. Modern scholarship has revealed the extent to which she was scapegoated for problems she didn't create and blamed for crimes she didn't commit. The real Marie Antoinette. Neither the monster of revolutionary propaganda nor the saint of royalist mythology has finally begun to emerge from centuries of political distortion. Yet even today, Marie Antoinette remains more symbol than person in popular consciousness. She represents different things to different people. The dangers of inequality, the excesses of the wealthy, the vulnerability of women in politics, the power of dignity in the face of hatred. Her story continues to resonate because it touches on fundamental questions about justice, power, and human nature that remain relevant in our own time. The guillotine that ended Marie Antoinette's life on that October morning in 1793 couldn't kill the questions her story raises about the nature of political violence and its consequences. Her execution was supposed to represent the triumph of justice over privilege, but instead, it demonstrated how easily justice can be corrupted by hatred and political necessity. The woman who died with such dignity exposed the brutality of those who demanded her blood. In the end, Marie Antoinette's greatest victory may have been her refusal to be destroyed by the hatred directed against her. The crowds that gathered to watch her die expected to see fear, desperation, or at least some acknowledgement that their cause was just. Instead, they witnessed a display of grace under pressure that shamed their bloodlust and challenged their assumptions about royal corruption. The transformation of Marie Antoinette from Austrian Archduchess to French Queen to revolutionary victim to historical symbol illustrates the power of individual human beings to transcend their circumstances through moral courage. Her story reminds us that dignity and grace are not the privileges of birth or wealth, but choices available to anyone facing life's ultimate challenges. The gilded cage of Versailles that had trapped her in luxury and isolation ultimately prepared her, in ways no one could have anticipated, for the spiritual tests of her final months. The woman who had never known real hardship discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. The queen who had been criticized for her frivolity found depths of character that impressed even her enemies. Marie Antoinette's legacy thus transcends the political circumstances of her time and speaks to universal human experiences of suffering, growth, and redemption. Her story continues to fascinate because it demonstrates how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary dignity when faced with extraordinary challenges. The guillotine that was meant to end her story instead ensured its immortality, creating a symbol of human resilience that has outlasted all the political causes that demanded her death. The French Revolution didn't end with Marie Antoinette's death. It devoured itself with increasing ferocity, as if her execution had unleashed something that could never be satisfied. Within months of her death, the very people who had orchestrated her trial were facing the same blade they had used to kill her. The revolution had become a monster that consumed its own children. And Marie Antoinette's dignified death began to look less like justice and more like the first act of a tragedy that would claim thousands more lives. Maximilien Robespierre discovered this truth in the most personal way possible. The man who had justified Marie Antoinette's execution as necessary for the Republic's survival found himself branded as an enemy of that same Republic less than 10 months later. On July 28, 1794, he climbed the same scaffold where the Queen had died, facing the same bloodthirsty crowds that had celebrated her death. The irony was lost on no one who remembered his speeches about revolutionary justice. But the real tragedy was still unfolding in the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette's surviving children continued their slow destruction. 10-year-old Louis Charles, the boy who should have been King Louis XVII, was dying by inches in a cell that had become his entire world. The tuberculosis that would eventually kill him was eating away at his lungs while Revolutionary Guards continued their systematic psychological torture. The child had been so thoroughly broken by his captors that he no longer remembered his mother with love. When visitors occasionally glimpsed him through his cell door, they saw a hollow-eyed boy who had been taught to curse the memory of the woman who had once sung him lullabies. The revolution that claimed to protect children had destroyed this one as surely as if they had put him on the scaffold. His sister, Marie-Thérèse, fared slightly better, but only because she was older when their ordeal began. At 17, she had witnessed horrors that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had heard her mother's execution being celebrated in the streets below her window, She had watched her brother being systematically tortured by men who claimed to be saving him from royal corruption. When she was finally released in 1795, she was a broken young woman who would never fully recover from her experiences. The irony was that these children, who had been portrayed as symbols of royal oppression, were actually victims of a system more brutal than anything the old monarchy had ever devised. The revolution that promised to create a better world for French children had instead pioneered new methods of child abuse that would have shocked medieval tyrants. Meanwhile, across Europe, the consequences of Marie Antoinette's execution continued to ripple outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Her death had convinced every European monarch that the French revolutionaries were enemies of civilization itself, leading to a series of wars that would devastate the continent for more than 20 years. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate French strength instead created enemies that would eventually destroy the Republic. Napoleon Bonaparte understood this when he seized power in 1799. The young general who had risen through revolutionary ranks recognized that Marie Antoinette's execution had made reconciliation with European monarchs nearly impossible. Her death had created a blood debt that could never be repaid, ensuring that France would remain isolated and embattled for as long as the Republic survived. Yet Napoleon also understood the power of Marie Antoinette's story to shape public opinion. When he declared himself emperor in 1804, he was careful to distance his new regime from the violence of the revolutionary period. He allowed exiled nobles to return to France, and even restored some confiscated properties. Most significantly, he arranged for proper burials for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, whose remains had been thrown into unmarked graves during the Terror. The ceremony that finally laid Marie Antoinette to rest took place in 1815, more than 20 years after her execution. Napoleon had fallen by then, and the restored Bourbon monarchy was desperate to heal the wounds left by revolutionary violence. The woman who had been vilified as a monster was now officially recognized as a martyr. Her suffering transformed from a symbol of revolutionary justice into evidence of revolutionary excess. But this official rehabilitation couldn't undo the damage her execution had caused to French society. The precedent of killing rulers established a pattern of political violence that would plague France for generations. Every subsequent revolution would invoke her memory, sometimes as a victim to be avenged, sometimes as an oppressor whose fate awaited other tyrants. The July Revolution of 1830 saw crowds marching through Paris carrying portraits of Marie Antoinette alongside images of more recent victims of royal oppression. The revolutionaries of 1848 debated whether to execute Louis-Philippe as their predecessors had killed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Even the Paris Commune of 1871 referenced her death when justifying their own acts of political violence. Each generation of French revolutionaries had to grapple with Marie Antoinette's legacy, trying to decide whether she represented everything wrong with the old regime or whether her execution had gone too far. The woman who had died with such dignity became a test case for French attitudes toward political violence, a mirror that reflected each generation's capacity for hatred and forgiveness. The international community never forgot the precedent her execution had established. When revolutions swept across Europe in 1848, monarchs remembered what had happened to Marie Antoinette and responded with preemptive violence designed to prevent similar fates. The revolution that was supposed to inspire liberation movements across Europe instead taught rulers that compromise was dangerous and repression was necessary. The German states, in particular, were shaped by memories of Marie Antoinette's fate. As an Austrian archduchess, she was seen as a Germanic princess murdered by French radicals. Her death became one of the founding myths of German nationalism, evidence that French aggression threatened all German culture. The wars of liberation against Napoleon were fought partly to avenge her memory and prevent similar outrages against German royalty. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Marie Antoinette's execution was on European attitudes toward women in politics. The vicious sexual accusations made against her during her trial became a template for attacking any woman who sought political influence. Her fate was used to justify excluding women from political participation, with critics arguing that female involvement in politics inevitably led to corruption and disaster. This gendered dimension of her story proved remarkably persistent. Throughout the 19th century, women who challenged traditional roles were routinely compared to Marie Antoinette, accused of the same vanity, frivolity, and foreign loyalties that had been used to justify her execution. The Queen's death became a warning about what happened to women who overstepped their proper boundaries. Yet at the same time, Marie Antoinette's courage in facing death inspired women across Europe who faced their own struggles against oppression. Her final letters, with their emphasis on forgiveness and moral courage, were copied and circulated in women's networks throughout the continent. She became a model of how to maintain grace and dignity under extreme pressure, a lesson that transcended political boundaries. The religious revival that swept through Europe in the early 19th century was also shaped by Marie Antoinette's story. Catholic churches across the continent presented her as a Christian martyr who had forgiven her enemies and faced death with faith intact. Her transformation from frivolous queen to suffering saint provided powerful ammunition for religious leaders who wanted to combat the rationalism and materialism associated with revolutionary ideals. This religious rehabilitation of Marie Antoinette proved particularly important in regions where the Catholic Church was struggling against secular authorities. In Ireland, Poland, and the Italian states, her story became part of a broader narrative about faith triumphing over persecution. The woman who had been accused of corruption and immorality was recast as a model of Christian virtue. The artistic and literary response to Marie Antoinette's execution continued evolving throughout the 19th century, as romantic sensibilities replaced revolutionary fervour. Writers like Alexandre Dumas and Victor Hugo found in her story all the elements of perfect romantic tragedy. A beautiful heroine trapped by circumstances beyond her control, exotic settings filled with luxury and danger, political intrigue that destroyed innocent love, and a noble death that redeemed past mistakes. These romantic interpretations of Marie Antoinette's story proved far more influential than historical scholarship in shaping popular understanding of her life and death. The monster created by revolutionary propaganda was gradually replaced by a tragic heroine whose suffering ennobled her character. This cultural rehabilitation proceeded alongside political changes that made criticism of the revolution more acceptable in French society. The painters who had once competed to create portraits of the living queen now turned their attention to depicting her suffering and martyrdom. Countless canvases showed her in her prison cell, reading her Bible or writing final letters to her children. Others depicted her final journey to the scaffold, emphasizing her composure and dignity in the face of mob hatred. These artistic representations helped establish the visual iconography that would define her memory for generations. The musicians of the Romantic era also found inspiration in Marie Antoinette's story. Operas and symphonies celebrated her as a tragic figure whose death revealed the violence lurking beneath revolutionary idealism. Her final moments on the scaffold became the subject of numerous musical compositions that emphasized the pathos of her situation rather than any political message about royal oppression or popular justice. But it was in the realm of popular culture that Marie Antoinette's rehabilitation proved most complete. By the middle of the 19th century, she had become a figure of fascination rather than hatred for ordinary French people. Guidebooks to Versailles presented her as a tragic victim of political circumstances, while popular novels portrayed her as a woman more sinned against than sinning. This transformation of Marie Antoinette from political monster to romantic heroine reflected broader changes in European society as the immediate passions of the revolutionary period cooled. The generation that had demanded her blood was dying off, replaced by people who could view her story with more detachment and sympathy. The violence that had once seemed necessary now appeared excessive and cruel. The emergence of more professional historical scholarship in the 19th century also contributed to Marie Antoinette's rehabilitation. Historians gained access to previously secret archives and began to separate fact from propaganda in accounts of her life and death. They discovered that many of the accusations made against her had been fabricated or grossly exaggerated, while her genuine efforts to help French people had been ignored or minimized. These scholarly investigations revealed the extent to which Marie Antoinette had been scapegoated for problems she didn't create and blamed for crimes she didn't commit. The real woman who emerged from this research was neither the saint of royalist mythology nor the monster of revolutionary propaganda, but a complex human being who had made mistakes while trying to navigate impossible circumstances. The 20th century brought new perspectives on Marie Antoinette's story as historians developed more sophisticated methods for analyzing the past. They began to understand how gender, nationality, and class had intersected to make her a perfect target for revolutionary hatred. Her foreignness made her suspect, her femininity made her vulnerable, and her wealth made her resented, creating a toxic combination that sealed her fate. Modern scholars also recognized how Marie Antoinette's execution had established precedents for the political violence that would characterize European history for the next century and a half. Her death marked the beginning of an age when killing political enemies became acceptable, even admirable, if it could be justified in the name of popular justice or national necessity. The feminist movements of the 20th century had to grapple with Marie Antoinette's complex legacy. On one hand, the vicious attacks on her character demonstrated the particular vulnerability of women in political life. The sexual accusations made against her, the emphasis on her spending habits, and the foreign origins that made her loyalty suspect all reflected broader patterns of how women in power were attacked and undermined. On the other hand, Marie Antoinette's courage in facing death provided an inspiring example of female strength under extreme pressure. Her refusal to be broken by hatred and her maintenance of dignity in the face of mob violence showed that women could display the same moral courage as men when confronted with ultimate challenges. The development of mass media in the 20th century also shed new light on the techniques used to destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation. The combination of sexual innuendo, xenophobic appeals, and class resentment that proved so effective against her became recognizable as early examples of modern propaganda methods. Her character assassination pioneered techniques that would be used by totalitarian regimes throughout the 20th century. Students of genocide and political violence recognized in Marie Antoinette's story patterns that would be repeated in more systematic forms during the Holocaust and other mass atrocities. The process of dehumanizing victims, creating elaborate mythologies about their crimes, and using their deaths to justify further violence had been perfected during the French Revolution and applied with deadly efficiency against the Austrian Queen. Yet perhaps the most important lesson of Marie Antoinette's story was not about the techniques of political violence, but about the possibility of human dignity in the face of hatred and oppression. Her transformation from frivolous teenager to woman of moral courage demonstrated that even the most unpromising circumstances could produce genuine character development. The gilded cage of Versailles that had trapped her in luxury and isolation had also, paradoxically, prepared her for the spiritual challenges of her final months. The woman who never known real hardship discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. The queen who had been criticized for her superficiality found depths of character that impressed even her enemies. This personal transformation gave Marie Antoinette's story a universal dimension that transcended the specific political circumstances of the French Revolution. Her journey from privilege to suffering to spiritual growth spoke to fundamental human experiences that remained relevant across cultures and centuries. She became a symbol of how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary dignity when faced with extraordinary challenges. The crowds that gathered to watch Marie Antoinette die expected to witness the humiliation of royal privilege and the triumph of popular justice. Instead, they saw something that challenged their assumptions about power, violence, and human nature. The woman who faced death with such composure and grace revealed the poverty of spirit among those who demanded her blood. Her final apology to the executioner for stepping on his foot became one of the most powerful moments in the entire revolutionary period, a gesture that encapsulated everything the revolution had failed to achieve. Here was genuine courtesy and consideration for others, displayed by someone who had every reason to be consumed with hatred and self-pity. The revolution that promised to create better human beings had instead produced mob violence, while the despised queen demonstrated the very virtues that Republicans claimed to champion. The executioner himself, Charles-Henri Sanson, understood the significance of this moment. In his memoirs, he wrote that Marie Antoinette's automatic politeness in her final seconds revealed more about her true character than all the propaganda that had been written about her. The woman, who had been accused of heartless indifference to others, showed more genuine humanity in her last moments than her accusers had displayed throughout their campaign against her. This paradox haunted the revolutionary period and continues to challenge our understanding of political violence and moral courage. Marie Antoinette's execution was supposed to represent the triumph of virtue over corruption, but instead it revealed the moral bankruptcy of those who demanded her death. The guillotine that was meant to create justice instead demonstrated the power of forgiveness and dignity to shame hatred and cruelty. The woman who had been trapped in a gilded cage at Versailles ultimately found a freedom that her captors never achieved. By refusing to be destroyed by their hatred, by maintaining her humanity in inhuman circumstances, and by facing death with grace rather than despair, Marie Antoinette transcended the political categories that had defined her life and achieved something approaching immortality. Her story continues to resonate not because of her political significance, which was always limited, but because of her moral journey from frivolity to dignity under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The Austrian Archduchess who became Queen of France and died as a victim of revolutionary violence ultimately became something more universal, a symbol of the human capacity for growth, forgiveness, and grace in the face of hatred and death. The guillotine that ended Marie Antoinette's life could not destroy the example she set, or the questions her story raises about the nature of justice, the corrupting effects of hatred, and the possibility of maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances. Her execution marked not the triumph of revolutionary ideals, but their failure, not the defeat of the old world, but its moral victory over the new. In death, Marie Antoinette achieved what she had never managed in life. She became genuinely admirable. The woman who had been criticized for her superficiality and self-indulgence displayed depths of character that shamed her critics and inspired future generations. Her transformation from victim to victor, from symbol of oppression to emblem of dignity, demonstrates that even the darkest circumstances can produce unexpected light. The gilded cage that had confined her at Versailles was replaced by a prison cell that somehow liberated her spirit. The luxury that had corrupted her was stripped away to reveal virtues that luxury had hidden. The political revolution that destroyed her life created the conditions for a personal revolution that redeemed her character and secured her immortality. Marie Antoinette's final victory was not political, but moral, not public, but private, not revolutionary, but deeply human. She proved that dignity and grace are not the privileges of birth or wealth, but choices available to anyone facing life's ultimate challenges. Her legacy transcends the political circumstances that destroyed her and speaks to universal human experiences of suffering, growth, and the possibility of redemption, even in the face of death. The ripples from Marie Antoinette's execution spread far beyond the borders of France, reaching into drawing rooms and royal courts across Europe where her story was whispered in horrified tones. In Vienna, her nephew Emperor Francis II received the news while reviewing military dispatches from the ongoing war against France. The young emperor, barely 25 years old, had inherited an empire that stretched from the Netherlands to the Italian peninsula, but nothing in his education had prepared him for the reality that his own aunt could be publicly murdered by her subjects. Francis II's reaction was swift and decisive. Within hours of confirming Marie Antoinette's death, he issued orders mobilizing every available regiment for an intensified campaign against revolutionary France. The Habsburg military machine, which had dominated European battlefields for centuries, would now fight not just for territorial advantage, but for vengeance. The emperor, who had once viewed the French conflict as a manageable border dispute, now understood that he was facing an existential threat to the entire monarchical system. But Francis II's military response, however massive, could not address the deeper psychological impact of his aunt's execution on European royalty. In the gilded halls of Schönbrunn Palace, courtiers noticed that the emperor had begun posting additional guards around his own family. The casual informality that had characterized Habsburg court life gave way to rigid security protocols. If revolutionaries could reach Marie Antoinette in the heart of Paris, then no royal family anywhere was truly safe. The news travelled even faster to Naples, where Marie Antoinette's sister, Maria Carolina, ruled alongside her husband, King Ferdinand IV. The Neapolitan queen had always been the more politically astute of the Austrian sisters, and she grasped immediately that her sister's death represented a fundamental shift in European politics. The old world of diplomatic marriages and dynastic alliances was collapsing, replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Maria Carolina's response was characteristically dramatic and effective. She transformed her court into the headquarters of European counter-revolution, hosting émigré French nobles and funding secret agents who smuggled weapons and propaganda into revolutionary France. The queen, who had once competed with her sister over fashion and court ceremonies, now channeled that same intensity into a campaign of vengeance that would consume the rest of her life. In her private apartments overlooking the Bay of Naples, Maria Carolina kept a portrait of Marie Antoinette painted during happier times at Versailles. Visitors reported that she would stand before this image for hours, speaking to her dead sister as if she were still alive. The conversations, overheard by servants, revealed a woman consumed with guilt about her failure to save Marie Antoinette, mixed with a burning desire to make French Republic pay for its crimes. The Neapolitan court became a magnet for French royalists seeking support for restoration attempts. Exiled nobles arrived with elaborate plans for invading France and rescuing the surviving members of the royal family. Maria Carolina listened to these schemes with the desperate hope of someone who needed to believe that her sister's death could still be avenged, even though her rational mind understood that the old France was gone forever. Meanwhile, in London, the British government was discovering that Marie Antoinette's execution provided them with a propaganda weapon more powerful than any military victory. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger understood that British public opinion, previously divided about the war would be unify against France, could, by portraying the conflict as a struggle between civilization and barbarism. British newspapers, many of them subsidized by the government, published increasingly elaborate accounts of Marie Antoinette's final months. These stories emphasized her maternal devotion, her religious faith, and her dignity in the face of mob hatred. The woman who had been criticized in British society for her extravagance was now transformed into a symbol of refined femininity, destroyed by revolutionary brutality. The propaganda campaign proved remarkably effective among British women, who organised subscription drives to support French émigrés and sent petitions to Parliament demanding stronger action against the revolutionary government. Ladies who had never shown interest in foreign policy suddenly became passionate advocates for war against France, motivated by identification with Marie Antoinette's suffering as a mother and wife. But the most unexpected response to Marie Antoinette's execution came from an unlikely source: the emerging industrial cities of northern England, where working-class families were beginning to question their initial enthusiasm for the French Revolution. The execution of a mother and queen struck many British workers as excessive, even if they had no sympathy for monarchy in general. In Manchester and Birmingham, radical societies that had once celebrated French revolutionary victories began splitting over the question of political violence. Some members argued that Marie Antoinette's death was justified by centuries of royal oppression, while others contended that killing women and children was always wrong, regardless of political circumstances. These debates revealed deep philosophical divisions within the British radical movement that would influence working-class politics for generations. The news of Marie Antoinette's execution reached the farthest corners of Europe through a network of diplomatic correspondence, merchant communications, and newspaper exchanges that had been developing since the early 18th century. In Stockholm, King Gustav IV Adolf received the report while attending a court opera, and witnesses reported that he became so agitated that he had to leave the performance. The Swedish monarch, whose father had been assassinated by his own nobles just 2 years earlier, understood viscerally how quickly royal authority could collapse. Gustav IV Adolf's reaction was to impose new restrictions on Swedish noble privileges and to increase surveillance of potential dissidents. The young king, barely 20 years old when Marie Antoinette died, spent the rest of his reign fighting wars against revolutionary France while simultaneously struggling to maintain absolute authority at home. His obsession with the French threat eventually contributed to his own downfall, as Swedish nobles grew tired of expensive foreign wars fought in the name of monarchical solidarity. In Russia, Catherine the Great's response to Marie Antoinette's execution revealed the complex calculations that governed European diplomacy during this period. The empress, who had seized power through a palace coup that resulted in her husband's murder, was hardly in a position to condemn political violence in principle. Yet she understood that the French precedent of public royal executions represented a threat to the entire system of European monarchy. Catherine's solution was characteristically pragmatic and ruthless. She expelled the French ambassador from St. Petersburg, closed Russian ports to French shipping, and began preparing for military intervention against the revolutionary government. At the same time, she intensified repression against Russian nobles and intellectuals who showed any sympathy for revolutionary ideas. The empress, who had once posed as an enlightened reformer, now revealed herself as a defender of traditional autocracy. The impact of Marie Antoinette's execution on Russian society was particularly significant because of the large French émigré community that had settled in St. Petersburg and Moscow during the 18th century. These French tutors, artists, and intellectuals had shaped Russian high culture for generations, but now they found themselves viewed with suspicion by a government that saw all French people as potential revolutionaries. Catherine the Great's court, which had once prided itself on French sophistication and Enlightenment philosophy, now emphasized its Russian Orthodox identity and traditional Slavic values. The empress, who had corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, now presented herself as a defender of Christian monarchy against atheistic revolution. Marie Antoinette's death had forced European rulers to choose sides in a cultural war that went beyond mere political disagreements. The German states, fragmented into hundreds of separate principalities and free cities, responded to Marie Antoinette's execution with a mixture of fear and determination that would eventually contribute to German unification. As an Austrian archduchess, Marie Antoinette was seen as a Germanic princess murdered by French radicals, and her death became a rallying cry for German resistance to French expansion. In Vienna, Prague, and Munich, poets and intellectuals began writing works that celebrated Marie Antoinette as a martyr to German culture and Christian civilization. These literary productions, while often mediocre as art, proved remarkably effective as propaganda. They helped create a sense of German identity that transcended the traditional divisions between Catholic and Protestant, Austrian and Prussian, that had weakened German resistance to foreign invasion. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient institution that had governed German-speaking Europe for nearly 1,000 years, found new purpose in avenging Marie Antoinette's death. Emperor Francis II, despite his youth and relative inexperience, emerged as a symbol of German resistance to French revolutionary aggression. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate French strength instead united Germany's enemies and hastened the creation of the coalition that would eventually defeat Napoleon. But it was in the smaller German states that Marie Antoinette's execution had perhaps its most immediate political impact. Rulers of tiny principalities who had previously viewed the French Revolution as a distant curiosity now understood that their own survival was at stake. If French revolutionaries could kill the Queen of France, then no German prince or duke was safe from similar treatment. The result was a wave of repressive measures across the German states as rulers moved to suppress any signs of revolutionary sympathy among their subjects. Universities were placed under closer surveillance. Newspapers were censored more strictly, and travel between states was restricted to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas. The execution that was supposed to inspire liberation movements instead strengthened conservative reaction throughout Central Europe. Marie Antoinette's story is ultimately about transformation. The frivolous 14-year-old who stepped naked onto that Rhine River island in 1770 bore little resemblance to the composed woman who apologized to her executioner in 1793. Her journey from gilded cage to guillotine reveals how even the most privileged person can discover dignity through suffering and grace through adversity. The woman they called the Austrian whore became something far more powerful in death than she ever was in life. A symbol of human resilience that continues to challenge us today.